Welcome to Sew Very Easy. My name is Laura, and did you know that the St. Patrick's Day Leprechaun has made some new friends? He has made some gnome friends. And you can read all about the adventure in this book. So today I'd like to make one of these gnomes. I'm going to share the book a little bit with you, and I'm going to do something else with one of these gnomes. The fabric is from Benartex and it's called Luck of the Gnomes. So of course, for St. Patrick's Day, we do need some pot of golds, some 4-leaf clovers, and some rainbows. And there's a nice big panel with 4 of his new gnome friends with all of these little accessories. I have some projects to use with these little extra cutouts. The first thing I want to do is turn little Miss Kate into a pillow. Now the directions have us cut this shape out, cut a secondary fabric, and put them together. I like to do it just a little bit different. I do want to cut this out, but I don't have to be so fussy with those edges. So I'm just going to cut her right out. So I have little Kate, and what I want to do is iron her and then turn it over and trace the area that I want to stitch. We're going to be stitching right along this edge, not the little dotted edge. But I do not want any of that white showing in my pillow. So I'm going to take time and trace her out. And if you need to, you can put this on a light box or hold it up to a window. So this is my stitching line, which is the same as the stitching line in the front. Now this is a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So if you'd like, you can cut it out on this line and stitch a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I prefer to draw it, and that way I don't have to worry about the seam allowance. Now we're going to stuff this like a pillow. So we do need an area that we can leave open to put our fill in. So I'm going to iron this, put this fabric on, pin, and stitch all the way around. I'll cut all this extra fabric off when I'm done the stitching. And because we have some little curves, I would recommend taking your stitches and making them a little bit smaller. It's just going to be easier to turn the corners, and it'll be stronger in some of the other points. This is definitely a lot easier to control under the machine than if I had this odd shape. Now I can trim it out. And I didn't have to be over fussy. On the inside, we're going to find these little arrows. What that's representing is to put notches in that seam allowance. Those notches are going to make it turn right side out, and it's going to make it lay flat. Now you don't have to go with those marks. We just need to notch around. Another thing we're going to need to do is this area where we've left open. Take the seam allowance and press it. Press it on both sides. This is where we're going to hand stitch afterwards, so it's just going to be easier if we press it now. And trim off these edges, notch them. If you don't like a large seam allowance, you can make it smaller. And that is what is considered a notch. So we've taken a little chunk out, and we've come close to the seam allowance, but not cutting into it. Now if you happen to have a pair of pinking shears, the pinking shears are zigzagged. So I can cut around that, and it's going to give me the same thing as notching all the way around. So I'm just going to cut off all of that extra with my pinking shears. I've pressed the whole thing to set those seams. Now I can turn this right side out. When our gnomes are stuffed, we can pin and finish off that edge with just a basic whip stitch. Our little gnome ready to have some fun and have a day of play. Now I think if our gnome is playing for the day, they might need something to sleep with. So let's make a gnome blanket. So for the gnome blanket, I have two pieces of fabric that I put together. I stitched all the way around the outside, turned it right side out, pressed, and now I can close that off, and I'll just do a row of top stitching all the way around. So I have a pattern on one side, and on the other side I've chosen a nice green, and I want to put one of the other gnomes right here. So I'm going to use this as a nice big applique. You can put them in the corner, put them on the center, wherever you want. But in order for me to applique him on, I'm going to have to iron it right along that area that we would be sewing. So I've left a generous seam allowance because it's just easier to hold near the iron. And I'm going to go and I'm going to press all the way around. This point will be a little hard to press. So I'm just going to fold that top over a little bit and just stitch a little bit in that corner, a little bit of that point. I'm going to trim it off, and then I could turn that right side out. So that's just given me that curve. It's just easier to turn stitching than it is by pressing. Now I will go and finish pressing all of those edges all the way around. Once that first pressing is done, I'm going to go and trim a 1/4 inch seam allowance and then repress it. And once again, I will be using my pinking shears. Now that all those seams are turned, I can put him on the blanket. I'm going to put him in one of the corners, pin him down, and then I'm going to stitch and leave a little bit of an opening up here in his hat. With that little opening, I just want to make him a little puffy. So I'm just going to add a really small amount of fiberfill just to give him some puffiness. Once he has some puff in him, just finish stitching this area. So I have a nice puffy gnome, and I stitched through all of the layers. I have my pillow gnome. Now we can look at the book for a second. The book does have a story on how the gnomes meet the leprechaun. And then at the back of the book, there's a pattern to make a little box so that we can catch our leprechaun. So it's a little box with this lid. There's a pattern in there so that we can make little coins and a little bow and a 4-leaf clover. But on that panel with the gnomes, we do have all of these shapes. So I'm going to need some non-sewable fusible web. The non-sewable one is a heavier glue. So we have the paper on the one side. We still have that glue, but the glue is very strong. You can't sew through it, and that's what we're looking for. So I'm going to roughly cut out these little pieces in between those appliques. Once I have them placed down, I need to iron them on, but I don't want to get my iron dirty. So I'm going to use a piece of parchment paper and just iron just over this area. I don't need to do the whole area, just the area where my little pieces are. And that parchment paper does not stick on the glue part. Now roughly cut them out. Once this is cooled down, peel off the paper and fuse it onto another piece of fabric so we have two right sides. And be sure to use that parchment paper. When it's cooled down, peel off that paper and cut around those shapes. So I have all of my little treasures cut out that will go inside my leprechaun catcher. I can put the lid on, and who knows, I might even catch a leprechaun. If not, I do have a fun book to read, the pattern for the box. I've made a nice puffy blanket so that my gnome has somewhere to sleep. This is just a fun project in time for St. Patrick's Day. Happy St. Patrick's Day, everyone. Thanks again for joining me. Bye for now.